Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and I'm here with my co-host and friend, Dr. Galen Clavio. And my goal this summer, life goals, is to update the introduction to a video that is not a black screen. So now that's been put out into the universe. Other people will hear it. Maybe 5 other people will hear it, and then I'll actually do it.
I have some tools for you that use AI that you might be interested, that might help with the process. So
Yeah, I have it. Is that, you know how that you have that to-do list where this is the things I get to do if all the things that have to be done now happen? That list has not been touched yet during the academic year. So I am hopeful that this summer that can come off of that. And then I'll be reaching out to you about some cool tools. That's like the good use of AI, right? Like I don't need to spend hours, and I'm not of like I could not create something from scratch myself to
you
have
could.
as an intro video. I mean, I could.
It's
I
a
could, but
terrible
the
attitude to have, Becky. What are you
you're
doing?
right. You're right. Learning is good. I could learn how to do it, but the learning curve is very high. And so for me in that realm. So it will be nice to have some tools to help with that so that our listeners who watch on YouTube don't have to look at a blank screen for 45 seconds.
It's important. It is a visual medium. So
Every once in a while when we do this podcast, are in the media school and therefore better at all of those things than me.
there are some advantages to being, but that was also what I did for a career. Although I've had to learn all the video stuff that we didn't, there was no video in radio, back in the day. So I have had to be a lifelong learner on these things.
One might argue that we should all be lifelong learners in every industry and job and life, just generally speaking.
I have some faculty members who I know who would probably not agree with that. But anyway, we'll move on.
So, we wanted to finish talking about last episode. We were talking about the Chronicle of Higher Ed published report from last December 2024, talking about teaching Generation Z students. And we talked about 3 of the 6 kind of points that they made in the article. So, wanted to do a part 2 of that podcast to talk about the last 3. And I think we'll start with the one about students not being a mystery. You just need to listen to them. And I always find when I first read that, I found it super interesting because I have sat in a lot of discussions about I just don't understand students. They do things this way. That's not how things were when I went to college. It's not how things were 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago when I started teaching. And I just don't understand kids these days, which I am constantly reminding people that while they are much younger than us and getting younger than us every year because we get older and college students stay the same age range, they are not children like my 5 or 6, almost 6-year-old is. And this is such an easy point, really, I think, this whole listen to them thing, but maybe something that's undervalued by just faculty generally in higher ed.
Well, I think most of the people who are now professors remember their own schooling, and their attitude is, well, no one listened to me. It wasn't, the onus wasn't on the professor to listen to the student. The onus was on the student to listen to the professor. Why can't I have that for myself now? That is to some degree a bit of a subtext. It's not everybody, but I do think that there are people who feel that way because they don't understand why what they felt was a good learning system should have to be twisted to meet the needs of the incoming students. But this is also where I think when you're a student yourself, you're oblivious to the idea that there's a way of teaching that's kind of prescribed, and then that changes over time. And in fact, I think a lot of what millennials, especially, and Gen Z dealt with in school, they didn't realize was very different from what had happened like 10 or 15 years before that. And so, like, this is the whole get off my lawn thing. Like, you get to a certain age, and I think we've talked about this before, there's a cultural currency in complaining about younger generations of people. That is unfortunate, but it's just kind of a reality. I'm not sure how it is in other societies, but I know in American society, it's something that we engage in often, and I don't really understand it. I think it's kind of it's self-defeating in a lot of ways. It doesn't really get you anywhere other than make you feel like you're part of one particular in group and you're dealing with people that are in an out group.
Sometimes I wonder a little bit if it isn't to make ourselves feel better for not understanding new technology or new ways of interacting or new dialogue and lingo that young people say that makes no sense. And luckily, my husband is a army recruiter, so he has tried to keep me up to date on the things that the younger generation is saying that students might not say in my classroom directly to me, but they definitely say it to him as a recruiter. And so I do think that's a little bit of it is like we want to kind of keep that space a little bit for our own comfort and to give us legitimacy and not knowing all the newfangled things, the new TV shows, the new music, the new technology that students can be using. But I found it super powerful to actually, I don't know, pay attention when students walk in the room and it's class hasn't started and engage in their conversations that they're having about what they did over the weekend or what they watched or whatever small talk that they're engaging in because they often say things that really tell you a little bit of something about how their life is going that when you really reflect on that you can see why, oh well, students seem disengaged today.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this might be why. Here's something they're talking about that happened on campus that as a 40-year-old mom with small children at home and slightly disengaged from, don't really understand in the same way that they would. And I think there's power in interacting intentionally in those moments versus just letting yourself kind of stand up there awkwardly and stare at your computer like you need to do anything else to get class ready than other than what you've already done. I think that can be helpful and probably just, asking some questions, integrating we've talked about this before, like those opportunities to integrate feedback, like directly asking students what is helping you in this course, what isn't helping you, and then thinking through, okay, well, they said that, it was really depressing to get back early on this really terrible grade because I didn't give them maybe enough, I don't know, support early on in the course to figure out how I grade as a teacher and how I approach grading instead of being like, they just didn't try.
Right.
But when you ask them, you get some of that feedback.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a hard one for me to really like register an opinion that doesn't sound like irritated, I guess, because it just to me it's just kind of how I have run my classes and my programs forever is I've never been in a position the whole time I've been teaching, and it's funny. I was just down at the University of Miami for a retirement of a colleague who I worked with, and I realized when I was down there that it was the 18th anniversary of me going down there to look for housing for my first faculty job. So I've been doing this like full time now for 18 years, and in the entire 18 years, whether I've been teaching sport management or whether I've been teaching sports media or communication or anything like that, like my classes are generally very hands on, which means I have to work with the students very closely and I have to kind of get a sense of what they're doing and how everything fits. Now, there are certainly there's things I don't want to know about what's going on in their lives, but if they want to talk to me about things, I'm very open and willing to listen. And I think what you find is not just clues about how to make the class run better if they're having problems with certain things, but you can kind of get a sense, like, especially if you're dealing with smaller classes, there's things about individual students that you can observe or hear through conversation that can help you to unlock more of their potential in the class because you figure out, and this is something I think that is an artifact of the way that high schools and middle schools are set up now. For a lot of students, they're not necessarily wired to think of the professor as someone that they can relate to or communicate with. They haven't had high school or middle school teachers who set their classes up that way. I mean, everything is so test driven. Everything is kind of oriented towards a particular type of learning. If you go to a good high school, you might get a student who knows how to engage and is like, okay, the professor's not out to get me. But there's a ton of students I'll get who do not come from that background and who really do kind of feel like the classroom environment is adversarial rather than being collaborative with the instructor. It does make it difficult when you have people not giving effort, but I think understanding the locus of that lack of effort. Is it that they don't care, or is it that they don't understand why they should engage? And I think that that is a big issue with this particular generation. And we talked about this last time, where it's like, they want authenticity. They want to understand, like, if we're going to do something, where, like, how does this fit into the picture? They don't take it on faith that, well, the professor says we have to do this, therefore we must do it. They really do want to understand, like, why should I devote brain power to this? And a lot of, I think, faculty don't like having to explain themselves or why these things are as they are. But if you understand that that is the psychology of this particular generation, and understanding, like, why they feel that way and all the cultural and technological elements that have led them to feeling that way, I think, for me at least, it makes it a lot easier to understand why I would want to engage in that.
Yeah, I think this point ties really well to a couple of the other ones from last time that the Chronicle found in their research. And I'm the way that the article reads, they felt like this was a little bit distinct, but I think it is kind of interconnected there. And because you mentioned that the high school and even grade school environment is structured differently, I think the next point of the article, that students just want to be released from the pressure to be perfect, plays a lot into how secondary education for sure, but even primary education in the US and probably in other countries abroad is structured, in that those students are really like hyper focused on achieving the highest outcome possible, because that is the majority of their evaluation. And it might have been my first newsletter on LinkedIn, or maybe one of the first couple. I actually wrote about my son who started kindergarten last year, who was terrified to start kindergarten. And I finally got him to tell me why. And his why was because he didn't want to get an F. If he got an F in kindergarten, that was going to be the end of the world. And that was like,
Do they
why are you thinking about this?
do they give F's in
No,
kindergarten?
I don't even know why he's thinking about that, and I'm sure he saw it, on a YouTube video somewhere where kids were playing school, and so they were pretending to give each other Fs, but it was so interesting to see him be hyper focused on that. And I've seen little things like that, and we love our kindergarten, and the teacher is really focused on development. She's not highly focused on grades, and yet he still says things about being perfect most days of the week, and he's almost 6.
Yeah.
And so over, 10 years of education, they get to the end and, like, they feel a lot of pressure to be doing. Everybody tells them you have to be super involved, you have to get great grades, you have to be good at 20 different things to get into that college that you wanna get into. And even for the kids who maybe don't necessarily meet the top echelons of going to a Harvard or a Yale, that pressure is the environment around them, whether they internalize it or not. And it's interesting to think that they found that the one thing the Chronicle want, or students want, was to be released from that being the case. And I think that's something we can probably do as teachers, as we think about the way that we structure some formative or checkpoints on projects, and allowing for revision, and really trying to focus on some process based
Yeah.
work in our courses, so that, and even talking about our own failures, like, as a means to show them that perfection is not the thing that they necessarily need to strive for, because I think they view us as successful, or their parents as successful. So trying to draw them to, the importance of failure and mistakes in our classrooms, and then building it in as an okay thing to happen, could potentially help with that.
I agree with all of that. I think there is a little bit of a challenge with this generation where trying to distinguish between um, failure as part of the process, where you're trying your best but you got parts of the process wrong, and we are here to fix those things. And it's not a permanent failure, it's a procedural failure that can be addressed, and we can do better with that, versus I don't understand why I'm doing this, therefore I'm not going to try that hard, therefore I'm not going to put effort into it, therefore I fail. Like, there is a weird thing where people struggle sometimes, I've noticed in this generation, with distinguishing the two. And where it's like, well, this is where to some degree I think utilization of rubrics and other items becomes more important in classes where you can effectively apply those things. Because again, it's like breaking it down from a grade perspective, and first of all saying, well, here's the standard, and what does the standard get you? Like, is the standard an A? Is the standard in this class a B? And then exceptional work qualifies for an A? Where does all that land? But like, give me the criteria upon which the grading is happening. And I mean, look, one of my complaints when I was a student was how opaque the grading process tended to be, where it's, why did I get a C plus on this paper, or why did I get a B on this paper? And there was not notes necessarily that gave you a clear sense of why and what the relative structure of the grading was. And that, I think, bothers this generation a lot more. But I also think this generation, to some degree, has struggled at times with understanding like what they're supposed to be aspiring to, and where assignments and work build up to that. And it's different for every walk of academia. And I think to some degree, it's like this generation struggles with, they don't watch TV, they don't read books, they don't, like, they'll, if they listen to a podcast, they maybe listen to one, and it's generally this, it's something that's tied into a cultural interest. And a lot of it is like, when you're, and this is I don't necessarily blame the generation as much as I don't know that there's a good answer for figuring out how to fix it. Because when you grow up in an absence of information, which you and I did, both growing up in the Midwest, in, essentially places where all we were getting our news and information from was like mass media, you start to seek out information to fill the gaps. Well, this particular generation is bombarded with information every day of every single type. And so, as much as I get frustrated that, in my area, like, they want to be a sports broadcaster, but they don't watch sports broadcasting. It's like, why do you want to do this? It's like, well, that concept of working in this area and talking about it, and they're focused on the people that they see in short video clips all the time. And I was like, well, that's not really who you need to focus on. So there's this long process of reorienting them towards what the business is, and what the industry is, and what the career pathway is. And that's hard to get into a grading structure, because you're normally, like, historically, I feel like our generation, or our two generations, although we're kind of in the same boat, had the information, and it was a matter of, oh, I can go learn about this and how it's made. Here, it's almost like you have to teach them the information first, because it's not about the abundance that surrounds them. It's about drilling down on the things that are important and making those connections to the material. Because a lot of the folks in Gen Z, if you're working with anything with computers, working anything with technology, they already have the skills. What they need is the context. And the context can sometimes not be the kind of thing that we were trained to teach. And you pick up any textbook, and most of the textbooks are very, like, context poor, I guess would be the way that I would describe them.
Well, by design, because when you put context in them, you will have to update them more often because context changes.
It's why I really struggle to, like, participate in textbook projects anymore. Because I've written many chapters, and I wrote a whole textbook myself. I insisted on doing my textbook in a particular way, with the idea that I was going to have to update it every few years. And then, of course, I got an administrative job, which is making that almost impossible. But a lot of the ways that the publishing industry decided 25, 30 years ago was the way to teach people doesn't work now. But because they're still making money off of it, because their books are being assigned by people who read textbooks when they were in school and adopted them, and they're easy to execute, I think that actually complicates the learning process. Because I think a lot of people in this generation look at a textbook, read through it, and they're like, this really feels like I could get far more detailed information on any aspect of this by asking ChatGPT as opposed to reading it in some book that was written 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, you're probably spot on with that. I do think the concept of the rubric is so interesting because I have always been a big fan of rubrics. I think it helps with the clarity and what you're looking for in assignments. But when I read this statement about wanting to be released from the pressure to be perfect, it almost makes me feel like I'm working against that then because so often students are like, okay, well, here's the box I have to check.
Right.
Here's what I need to do to check it. Here's the points I get if I check it. It's almost like reinforcing that need to earn points. And unless we go all the way into ungrading, which we talked about a few
Right.
months ago, we can't just completely get rid of the evaluation aspect completely. But I do think that we kind of have to balance like, what does our rubric say, and how do we present the outcomes of what we're asking them to do in ways that show that maybe getting it 100% isn't necessarily the goal. The goal is, did you move from a 10% understanding to any more than 10%, any percentage higher than 10% of the understanding you had before? And that's something I've been thinking and struggling a lot about, and been writing and thinking about for this summer as a project, is just like, how do we balance this grade transparency guidance with the releasing them from this pressure to feel like they have to get that 100% or 100 points on that assignment?
Yeah, I mean, and it is tough, and I don't have a great answer for it because, like, professors didn't create the pressure that students
Right.
feel. That was created oftentimes by, well, it's really a societal creation that's been taken up and paraded around by parents, for whom oftentimes the entire pre-college trajectory of their children is based upon putting them in the best position to go to a particular college, get a scholarship, whatever. And it makes everything transactional in nature.
Right.
And I think that's there's no way in one semester or even in a 3 or 4 year span, I think you can easily unprogram a kid from being in that situation. But I think the flip side is, regardless of what the raw materials are that you're dealing with students, you have to highlight what they need to know in whatever discipline you happen to be teaching them in. And so that's where, like, from a rubric perspective, I always have a category where there's some squishiness, I guess, in the way that I grade, to go along with the more like the bones of what it needs to be. And I think you've got to maintain that, but you also have to communicate to students. Like, and again, I think in more cut and dried areas of education, it's maybe a little bit simpler. If you're teaching accounting or if you're teaching engineering, like, there's a right answer, there's a mathematical answer, or there's a computational answer. Not always, but a lot of times. If you're in something that's more creative or more analytical, where it's about applying things, I think that's where, like, to me, the rubric's more about, well, show me what you were using as the basis for your thought process. If that's coming from inside your own head, walk me through that process. If it's coming from things that you're referencing, walk me through what you used and why did you choose those things. And at the very, one of the things that I've found in my classes, is, if I'm doing something like that, and it ends up being a good defense against AI generated answers. It's not about the core answer. It's about, well, what did you use for resources and why did you choose those? Explain that to me. And if they can't, they probably cheated. But it also kind of gives me a sense of, like, okay, maybe I need to expose you to this or that you didn't know existed or that you weren't aware of. A lot of it really does come back to reading, watching, doing things, like being exposed to things. And it's where, to some degree, I oftentimes think, Becky, about, it was Kansas on a semester system.
Yes.
So you got 15, 16 weeks per subject. I often think about, is that even something that's a realistic structure for, Gen Z kids? Like, is it something where is that a worthwhile, like a 3 credit hour course over a 15, 16 week session, feels like it's designed for something that was going on in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to something that's designed today, we're probably not going to be doing a whole bunch of fundamental changes to the way that college is taught, but maybe we should be, because I don't think, I think the direction that Gen Z is going, or has gone, or is already there, is going to be it's going to be, that's a less extreme version of what's going to happen when Gen Alpha hits college age. And because if you look at the lineup of how we went from the different generations to where we ended up with the millennials, and I know it feels like what's happening in Gen Z is like way over here, but most millennials, if they're being honest, realize that they were an embryonic version in the way they prefer to be taught of how Gen Z now prefers to be taught. Now might be a good time to be thinking about the entire process of teaching in the classroom, not just these little bits and pieces of the material being changed.
Well, I think that sounds like another podcast episode. I'm going to write that down as a topic, probably for, I don't know, a 7, 8 part series. Does that sound about right?
Yeah,
So,
like a series of 1 credit hour classes, which I think is what I'm actually proposing here. Which nobody's got time to prep all of those things is the issue.
well, it depends on how long they are,
Yeah.
like how many weeks they are, right?
Right.
So, well, we're circling back to that because I was just, have been thinking so much about generative AI's impact on teaching, and I 100% from the foundation of my being believe that higher education is going to have to change
Yep.
in a large, substantial way. So we will table that because I want to get to our last point, and I don't want our listeners to have to take a 40-minute run instead of a 30-minute run to listen to the podcast this
Buy
week.
a dog. Walk the dog. Okay, the dog can get some extra steps in while you listen to the last 10 minutes. Anyway, go ahead, please.
All right. So our last one that they talk about is that students want to put work and school on equal footing. And the way the article talks about it, it is more about they want us to help them see how what we're doing in the classroom will apply to their future jobs, which is certainly something that is important. But I actually also think this extends to the way I've experienced students in the last probably 5 to 7 years. Most of them are actually working while they're in school, whether it's part-time, some of them full-time. Hi, doggy. My dog's down here too because of the thunderstorm, so he's just, like, hiding under my chair out of terror.
Stuart wanted to say hi. Oh, hello.
Oh,
Oh,
I
thank you.
love doggies.
Oh, that's a good boy. Anyway,
So, by the way, dogs in the classroom are really popular. I brought mine one time to office hours, and it was the most well-attended office hours I've ever experienced.
yeah,
So I do sorry, now I'm distracted because dogs, like, it's hard to dislike dogs.
it is.
That's why Rudy shows up. My dog Rudy shows up in PowerPoint presentations often in class because, like, it's just hard to not be happy when there's a cute picture of a dog on a slide.
Oh yeah, I bring Stuart into class all the time. He's a big hit. So
I can only imagine.
anyway,
So yeah, sorry. We digress collectively. So I do see more students working full and part time than I have seen in previous years, and they they are not always willing to not work to come to class or to work on an assignment. I get a lot of requests for extensions because somebody got called in to cover a shift and they want the money and in sometimes the experience. I know that sometimes as a faculty, it might be tempting to devalue even those service jobs that they might be working. But I don't know about you, Galen, but I learned a whole lot from working in college part-time jobs in service industry and hotels and bars and restaurants that has actually helped me in my education as well as my career. But sometimes I think we're kind of like, well, your focus is supposed to be in the classroom, but that's not always realistically for students, to be honest.
I mean, it's another adaptation at the college level. Now, I think like this is where, again, a lot of it depends on the area that you're teaching in, and what, the fact that we've got a much more mixed group of students in terms of socioeconomic background and career direction. Where I worry sometimes with Gen Z is they almost don't see the trees for the forest. Like they get caught up in the big picture thing, but not understanding that there's like a lot of little things along the way that add up to that. And it's like, this is a little bit of a different angle from what you just said, but I deal with a lot of kids in performing arts because I'm in media, and I had one the other day who was like, I'm really interested in discovering how to find my voice. And first of all, this is a freshman that said this, and you know, I listened to her talk, and I'm like, I think you're going about this backwards. Like, you need to figure out the tools and you need to figure out the pathways. The voice will come over time as you do work, and as it builds. But I think that a lot of times Gen Z, if I have it's not a criticism as much as an observation, they tend to start at the end and think that the end is where they need to be. And I see this a lot with the working during school. Some have to do it as a financial reality. But that's kind of been the case with college for the last 15, 20 years now. But a lot of them don't have to, but they feel like they're supposed to because they want extra money for X, Y, or Z. And it doesn't necessarily sync up with the thing that they're then studying for. And the idea that, okay, you're in college, you're having to do certain things because they get you on a track towards where you want to go. But the getting a professor to process that and understand it, and kind of deal with everybody's individual circumstance can be challenging for the professor. And I think it's almost like it's an unfair burden to place on somebody who oftentimes, like, the teaching is only 40% of their job, sometimes less than that. You're being asked to manage a bunch of different circumstances from a bunch of different students, all of whom are like, I demand that my particular circumstance be taken with a level of seriousness. And I think that to some degree, it's kind of, I look at it, it's bad prep for whatever career pathway they're going down. Because if the expectation is the institution or the class must bend to my circumstance, you create an environment where you think that that's how it's supposed to be. And to be frank, this is not something that started with Gen Z. This is something that millennials started. And that I've seen several people I went to school with, or not really, right? I guess people that were in school when I was like a grad student who I taught at that point, who have gotten into trouble in their careers and have struggled with advancement because they were like, well, whatever I'm doing in the moment is the most important thing, not I need to step back, take advantage of this environment, take advantage of the learning, and then incorporate that into what I'm doing, even if it means some temporary setbacks or step backs. It's not a very quick thing to get to where you want to go. So putting work and school on equal footing is obviously something that you need to think about. But as a college aged student, I would say a lot of what you're doing in college should be about social interaction, should be about finding yourself as a person. The learning is important, but it's not just the in class learning. And if you're saying I have a job, I must put that on the exact same footing as what I'm doing in the classroom, you better have a structure in place where both of those things can be taken advantage of to equal levels. Because the scenario you just described almost always ends up with the school being subordinate to the work, and that is not that's where I would actually ask the student, why are you in college at that point? Like, what's like, I know why you think you're there, but you're not giving it the attention it deserves by saying that the job has to be as important and I will schedule that over when I'm supposed to be in class because they're of equal importance. They're actually not in that case. You put the work ahead of school in most cases.
Yeah, you're probably right about that, that in those instances, that's definitely evidence of the work being before the school. And there's a lot of different elements of this, which I think you point out is like there are students who financially have to work because I've had students who are supporting their parents with their jobs while they're in college. But that might be quite different from students who maybe don't have a clear idea as to how they want to progress through education and what things they should be involved in and engaged in and how those support their career development. And as faculty, it is almost always going to be an individual case by case situation as you think about how to work through that. But I do think it is important to at least remember that even in those situations where the student in your mind, and maybe your mind rightly so, is making a poor decision by prioritizing work over school, that it could help us to better situate. And I think we probably should rename this podcast to Communicating Value in Education, because we come back to that time and time again.
That's
And that
a really boring
it
name.
is a terrible name. I know. You'd think I was a marketer or something, right? Um, but coming back to that idea of, can you communicate why what you're doing in the classroom is important for not only the work that they want to do in the future, but the five jobs they're going to have before they get there.
Yeah.
Because then when they're putting it an equal value in their mind, if you tell them why it matters for their future work, they might actually start to prioritize your class over that part-time job, because they will see that this actually is part of their long-term trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, I just to clarify, like I had a job in college. I had multiple jobs in college, but I scheduled them around class.
Right.
And what worries me, and honestly, I think this is a problem with colleges and the way that we recruit and the way that we onboard incoming freshmen. We do a bad job of explaining how all of this can work to people.
Yeah.
And that once you don't explain it initially, it gets harder and harder to explain the further into a college career somebody gets. And look, you and I are on the vanguard of saying universities need to change the way that they're doing things. Universities need to be more committed to supporting students in career pathways, because that's why people are coming to college. And the cadre of like the liberal arts instructors who insist that we're here to teach people how to think. It's like, no, that's if you're at a small private liberal arts school, yeah, it's probably true there. And B, your school might not exist in 5 years the way that things are going. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but that mentality is not in line with where the market is. It's not in line with where colleges, are trying to attract students. We're not attracting students by saying, come and learn how to think. We're attracting them by saying, come and get a career. Come and set yourself up for life. Come and get those higher earnings potentials that we trumpet in every study or every article about why you should go to college. But if you're going to do that, you need to prep people for like how to balance all these things. How to have a part-time job and not have it take over your life. How to understand that the college pathway is a gradual one, but there are good reasons why you're engaging in it along the way. I think to some degree colleges have gotten way too comfortable with just assuming that everybody knows their value, and also assuming that anybody who doesn't buy into it should just go do something else. Like it's an active sales job. We need to do a better job of advocating for colleges and universities with the idea, like as colleges and universities and professors, we need to put the value forward for students, because right now I think they get here and there's no structure or very limited structure. And so they just assume, well, this must not be that important because nobody's emphasizing it. And it's like, that's exactly the opposite. But without anybody emphasizing it, I'm not surprised that they feel that way.
And with that, that's the teaser for the next episode, where we will discuss the value of higher education. So I am going to stop us there because we already went past 10 minutes past. And also, that is our next topic. So if you keep listening to the next episode after this one, we will dive a little bit more into this value proposition idea in higher ed. As always, thank you for listening. If you find value, please share this with a colleague. If you give us a review on any of the podcast platforms, it helps us show up higher in search. And as always, please reach out with any comments or questions. You can find my email address in the show episode descriptions.
Bye.